to start with, I think the best thing is that some of the people who have been requested to be speaker for this roundtable, I would like all of them to introduce so that we all know each other quite well. Rather than, so I will just call each one's name, and you can say a few words about yourself, and then we will do an intro for the session, and we'll start the discussion. So to start with, as I told you, I'm Osama Munzir from Digital Empowerment Foundation. May I request Frederick Van Brie to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, my name is Frederike van Bree. Thank you for having me here. I'm Program Manager of the Digital Defenders Partnership, and we support critical voices in the internet who undergo digital threats. Very briefly.
Thank you. Brett is not here. May I request Mallory from APC?
Sorry. Hi, I'm Mallory Nodal from the Association for Progressive Communications. I'm based out of Montreal.
Thanks, Mallory. May I request Noel from Internet Society?
Hi, I'm Noel from the Internet Society. I'm a regional projects coordinator for Asia Pacific.
Chris Riley from Mozilla.
I'm Chris Riley, Head of Public Policy for Mozilla.
And may I also request Eric Johnson from Internews?
Hi, Eric Johnson from Internews. I've spent 25 years on access to information projects, donor-supported in developing countries, and now I live in China.
Great. I'm a great fan of Internews, by the way. Yeah. May I also request Joshai Ben Avi?
Hi, I'm Yochai Ben-Avi, Internet Policy Manager at Mozilla.
Thank you. So just to give you a little brief, DEF is based out of India, and we are spread all across India. If you can imagine the size of India, we are in 150 locations in India. And without having our physical office, we work in about 10 countries apart from India. One of the areas that we work in very aggressively, ambitiously is access and infrastructure. And among them, some of the learnings for the last 4 or 5 years for us is how do we take the infrastructure to the remotest part of the country, how to make access possible for the people who cannot imagine what is internet and what is access, because that is mostly available in urban areas and very sparsely available in rural areas. And we have experimented, apart from shared infrastructure, also using free spectrum, open spectrum, to establish wireless network in many, many parts of the country. So coming from that learning, but taking this entire learning to the level of policy and advocacy, we have been advocating not only in India but many other countries how we can have shared infrastructure, how we can use open spectrum, how we can make access possible to reach, because everybody is talking about billions of people not yet connected, billions of people not there on the internet. So how do we take this from policy perspective, from infrastructure perspective, from, I would say, in India what we call as jugaad, which is frugality, various frugal technologies, and in many, many ways, how can we take it? And that's what this entire discussion is all about. I have a small video that I wanted to share with you just as an example to start off. It will take us about three minutes, and then by then I'm sure we'll have even more people to be part of the discussion. So can I request you to show the video?
Saharias, or the residents of the jungle, are a tribe that live in Baran district of Rajasthan in India. The indices of Baran district tell a story of their own. 85% of the population of Baran is rural. More than 60% of the women are illiterate. More than 40% of the million-strong population is tribal. These tribal peoples of Baran are largely illiterate. Many of them are nomadic, homeless, bonded laborers. They eke out their living on a day-to-day basis. This does not mean that there are no opportunities for the Saharias and the other tribal people of the Barun district. The major problem is that news of opportunities and openings rarely reach them. Like many other rural and remote areas, information is the biggest casualty. It hardly ever gets through to the people who need it the most. Illiteracy, poverty, lack of identity, subjugation and exploitation have collectively oppressed the Saharias and the other tribals in Barun. Most people outside the area are not even aware of the Saharias' existence as they live in a media dark geography. However, things have begun to change quite dramatically. Vijay Roy, who is in his early 20s, is a Saharia tribal youth who got bitten by the broadband internet bug in 2010. He was working with the local NGO when he heard about the Wireless for Communities project run by the Internet Society and Digital Empowerment Foundation. He joined the training and learned about wireless networking, routers, modems, line of sight, mapping geolocations, planning networks and so on.
कंप्यूटर सीखने के लिए कोई ज़्यादा पढ़ा लिखा होना कोई ज़रूरी नहीं है, कोई मायने नहीं है। आप बस थोड़ा सा पढ़ना लिखना जानते हो तो इसका मतलब आप कंप्यूटर चला सकते हो।
Now as a lead wireless network engineer, Vijay has helped establish 8 major nodes all across Barun, some of them as far as 40 kilometers from each other. All the nodal points have facilities like video conferencing, telehealth, video cameras, webcam, projectors, printers, scanners and availability of more than 45 Mbps of broadband. Now the broadband wireless internet connectivity has already benefited at least 2,000 Saharia tribals through digital literacy, vocational programs, telehealth programs and entrepreneurial skill building.
So that was a small example of, this is even from Indian perspective, it's extremely remote area where not even electricity was available in that area. There's no towers, nothing, but it was built. But the main news here is using Wi-Fi network, open spectrum and using wireless technology. And this is across 200 kilometers. But this is just not only example, but we have done it about 12 locations and it is increasing. So, and we have been able to also convince government to use these kind of technology where there is a last backhaul node, because backhaul only goes up to a level. After that, there is nothing for the last mile. And as far as the data connectivity is concerned, mobile network is not enough. 3G is not there in all the remote part of the country. And this is just an example from India, but this is a situation in most of the African countries, most of the even South Asian countries, all the underdeveloping countries. So that is the broad background with which we come from, where we have been able to experiment some of the practical know-how on the ground. And with that note, let's start the discussion that how, and it's not important that we only talk about open spectrum. It is about making access possible to the highest number of people, and how, and if there are suggestions. So can we start with, as the name has listed, been and circulated, with Frederick to be first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, access is great. It's a world of opportunities. I would like to see it from the other perspective. There's also an importance of understanding the exposure and vulnerability once you are exposed to that world of opportunities. I've worked in South Africa with students in the townships, and they connected by mobile phones. they're all on Facebook, and the pictures they actually put online kind of shocked to me, you know. If they go into, for example, it could, you know, bring them in vulnerable positions. A smearing campaign, for example, in future, where those pictures can be misused, and yeah. So I would like to say, great to give them that opportunity to be online, but also the importance of teaching them the risks that they face. And we work with consultants in the field, and maybe it's nice if I share some of what he got out of the field. He said that the biggest problem in the field is that the majority of NGOs do not have a dedicated tech person. So it's very good that you actually educate those students, but do also the local community-based organizations, do they have a tech person in place? That when you're not there, that...
How does it work?
Yeah, how does it work? And I'm not sure if you use open source software, but
Open
this
source,
is...
yes.
Yeah?
It's all open source, yeah.
Okay,
Even
because
for video
that's what
conferencing.
our consultant came back with, like, open source software creates the extra difficulty for many users, because it's harder to get used to, and once something is wrong with it, to update it or to, so he speaks about the negative correlation between user-computer usage skill and the usability of such tools in a desktop solution. So those are some points I would just like to...
So actually, education is a big part, that how do we make local people, before getting connected, are you aware of what you're getting into, and is it sustainable in terms of technological aspect, and is the local resource enough skilled to take the responsibility to maintain, manage their own network or things like that. So yeah, so those were, I think, the highlight of your point. Taking us to the next person, is Brett here by any chance? No? Okay, Mallory, you are the next.
Sure. So I was going to talk about sort of two different things. First is a couple of policy misconceptions that lead to policy difficulties in getting connectivity to happen. And then the second one is an opportunity, some research that we've conducted on infrastructure sharing. So as far as the misconceptions, I mean, they're sort of related, but I would say the first one that I want to talk about is more about the state of play in the industry of mobile carriers. Osama mentioned that mobile connectivity is not enough in a lot of these regions, and that's a reality. And technologically, there are actually lots of other options. But I think what's happening in industry, which is then influencing policy. I mean, mobile carriers are extremely influential. Sort of the Broadband Commission, even the ITU, GSMA, you know, they're there and they're sort of talking about what is the pitch? I mean, it's like, you know, LTE. You know, you can get everything you want with LTE. Like mobile wireless connectivity is the way to connect the rest of the world. And that is just simply not true. So while it's the main perception, it's actually creating a lot of problems for the emergence of other technologies, like the use of TV white spaces. You know, so that's actually a huge misconception in the space, and is preventing a lot of movement on this at the policy level. And this sort of the influence, like one concrete way is that a lot of, like Wi-Fi, for example, is not related to mobile connectivity, but because of these perceptions and this influence to preserve sort of the industry dominance, a lot of like third-party use of Wi-Fi, there are no such licenses available for that. So that, you know, is one concrete example of how this sort of influence is negatively impacting availability. And that relates to infrastructure sharing, which I'll talk about in a second. Because the second perception in policy spaces among many governments is that TV white spaces is not ready yet, because digital switchover hasn't completely happened yet. So there's this perception that we have to wait until digital switchover is complete before then investigating TV white spaces. And this is related to the first misconception I was talking about, where a lot of people are saying, yeah, TV white spaces is a possibility, but there needs to be a lot more research done on it. It's actually not necessarily true. I think that's a sort of line that's said, and it's sort of making countries and policymakers reluctant to actually implement and investigate the use of TV white spaces. And actually then related to the digital switchover, there's some countries that the use of the white space is so little that it can happen now. There was a study, an implementation sort of trial study done by Google in South Africa, in Cape Town, which is one of the most densely, because of the mountains and everything, it's actually one of the most densely populated uses of spectrum, and they found no interference with just rolling out TV white spaces now, without waiting for the digital switchover. So those two things, so that mobile connectivity is not enough. We have to look at TV white spaces, and that we don't have to wait until the whole world has switched over the broadcasting to actually start using TV white spaces. Okay, so on a more positive note, then sort of some of the research that APC has done recently, we actually just published it 2 weeks ago, and I can send out some links via Twitter and so on, is about infrastructure sharing. So we've actually done some concrete studies and to actually come up with a sort of economical argument for infrastructure sharing. And infrastructure sharing is not just, saying that existing fiber or wireless towers need to be used by more than just the carriers. It's actually about laying fiber alongside public works. So it's laying it, if you're doing some, if you're laying sewer lines or putting up electricity, whatever. All of these are sorts of costs that can be shared to as well at the same time roll out mostly fiber, right? But as far as wireless, you can mount access points on various existing infrastructure like bridges, buildings, that sort of thing. So just in short, I think it's worth sort of propagating these projections, because the savings for governments and municipalities and are huge to actually in the ways that excess can be integrated into public works infrastructure building has such great potential. So those are my only interventions. Maybe there are questions later, but.
Yeah, thanks, Mallory. In fact, infrastructure sharing is a big issue everywhere. In India, at the moment, not all the towers are also shared by the telcos. Only 3 of them share the towers or created a new company where they are building towers together. But not all of them. There are many, many telcos. So that's a big blow on environment also, and of course the huge cost of maintaining those towers. Beside that, in many places, one telco has got a backhaul available, but the other telco could take this forward to different, rather than creating another backhaul parallelly. So lots of backhauls are being created, but there is nobody who is taking the last point to the further households. White space is certainly not opened up in India at all, and that's available unused. And that creates a huge issue, because that crosses the physical barrier, and then because of the data connectivity, that's a big barrier issue. But having said that, there are many infrastructure which is available and not being used by RailTel, for example, railway network. Railway is India's biggest network, one of the second largest in the world, but that is not being shared, in a big manner. Great. Just to take the discussion forward, may I request Noel from Internet Society to share her viewpoints?
Thanks, Osama. Just a comment on the white space. In the Philippines, where I'm based, they've started piloting the white space project, and it was incredibly useful. Especially, it was piloted in the Central Islands, and it was incredibly useful, especially during the disasters. There was the Haiyan typhoon a few years ago, and also the earthquake that struck that island, and they were able to deploy it within hours, and it was within use. It was in use within hours. So I think the challenge that the Philippines is now facing is really to have a permanent kind of a policy framework that allows for the white space to be used in an unlicensed or in an unlicensed manner. What I wanted to kind of talk about is more on the project that we're doing with DEF, which is the book that you have in front of you. It's the Wireless for Communities, and I think in talking about unlicensed spectrum and the use of unlicensed spectrum, beyond talking about enabling access, it might be useful to also talk about what unlicensed spectrum, the approaches and the activities that unlicensed spectrum enables. So to get to that point, I would, maybe it's useful to discuss the components of the project, which there are three main components. One is the training of trainers. These are barefoot engineers. I think you've seen it on the video earlier, and this basically this builds local expertise. The second is to actually roll out the wireless mesh networks, and the third is to build digital literacy. In the process, basically integrating connectivity in the daily lives of the people, whether this is in enabling them to conduct their livelihood more efficiently. The weavers that you saw. That's a different video. It's in here. It's whether you're enabling traditional weavers to create their designs digitally, or enabling workers to report abuses to authorities more easily, which are some of the things that the project has been able to enable people to do. So I think those three components basically. What they do, aside from minimizing costs, is that it enables groups like us and communities to transcend the problem that we see too often in the development field, in that there's a well-meaning group that comes into a community, brings in an innovation. And then 3 years down the line, it's in disrepair, and the community has gone back to their old ways. And I think this happens mainly for a number of reasons. One of them is that there's not enough buy-in from the community. They don't see it as relevant enough to their daily activities. And the second is that there's no local expertise. And the third is that there's not enough funding to maintain the project if it falls into disuse. I suppose the main point that I wanted to get to is that these approaches enable it makes it easier for to foster the ownership of these projects, the community ownership, and that's very important, not only in the sustainability of the project, but also in building self-sufficiency among communities. If we're trying to connect these communities in marginalized communities in hard-to-reach areas, it's important to also foster self-sufficiency, because these are communities whose needs are not being met by mainstream institutions, and they're not being reached by mainstream institutions. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Noel. There are two things that even Frederica has also pointed out about education and literacy and all that. So that certainly is an integral part of most of the network that we create. Also because it's a medium that you cannot avoid. You know, you are getting from print medium to the digital, and digital, if you don't know, then you don't know how to handle yourself. And one of the success stories is also in one of the weaving community. We did this entire wireless, and now this entire community has built a e-commerce website, and they are selling products online, you know. So that's what I thought. I'll open it up and show it to you. And that it is not only leading in terms of literacy, education, and skilling, but also opportunity in terms of doing business, and not only being a buyer, but being a producer and seller also, you know. So connectivity has its own advantage, access has its serious advantages. Just to take the discussion forward, may I request Eric now, if you can speak.
So I can't speak for all the other speakers, but I didn't communicate with my colleagues before we began, so I thought I'd try and pick something really crazy that I thought maybe nobody else would talk about, and that's OpenBTS. This is a technology that I have not played with, but I have always wanted to. So when we talk about unlicensed spectrum, in this case, OpenBTS is a cellular base station, which functions as a femtocell, sort of, and then needs its own internet backhaul to essentially interconnect to the public switched voice network through some sort of SIP provider. I have read about these systems being deployed in West Papua, in Indonesia, in Mexico, in island nations in Southeast Asia, and in Zambia. And I've always wanted to get my hand on one. I haven't yet. I keep thinking about writing a proposal one of these days, but it's really a solution only for the most distant, most difficult to serve place, because it would require probably a satellite connection of its own to provide that internet backhaul. But in remote places, that is probably the only way to go. It's certainly the way to go on my farm in Iowa, in the middle of the United States, where the only internet my parents have is literally a satellite connection. We do not have 3G or 4G. We don't have cable. We don't have fiber. We don't have. We can't run any of the standard connection methods, and this is, it turns out, not that rare a situation in many places in the U.S., not to mention elsewhere in the world. So OpenBTS is this. It's a cell phone routing protocol that's built into an open source operating system, and then built into a base station, BTS, a base transceiver station, which costs, I think, under $5,000. The problem then, of course, would be providing the backhaul, but if you set up an OpenBTS base station in a remote community, the interesting thing is you could essentially end up creating your own GSM provider, completely illegally, of course, but if you're far enough out, who's going to notice? And this is, I think it's just about the most literal interpretation that I can think of your assignment to talk about unlicensed spectrum.
And is it something like internet in a box or ISP in a box or something like that? Does it?
Well, it's GSM femtocell. Okay, so in order for it to work, it requires that the end users all have mobile phones. Mm-hmm. So it's not using Wi-Fi, which uses the ISM spectrum, which we could call it unlicensed, or there's sort of a general license that's issued in many countries. Some countries don't license it, or specifically don't allow people to use Wi-Fi, but by now most countries have adopted the ITU's recommendations to allow the 2.4 and 5.8 gigahertz bandwidth to be just sort of generally usable by anybody. But so this OpenBTS base station, it's not Wi-Fi. It's not using 2.4, it's not using 5.8, it's using standard GSM frequencies, so the 800, the 900, the 1800. And functionally, it just creates a cell phone base station where there wasn't any. And if we're talking about places where there's literally no connectivity, then this creates a gateway all of a sudden to the world. It does require that people have handsets, but oftentimes people have handsets even in the most remote areas because they travel from where they are, where they don't have connectivity, often to places that do have connectivity.
True.
It requires setting up a sort of a little local ecosystem because somebody's going to have to pay for that satellite backhaul. Right? But the system that I've been reading about in Mexico, which I've been thinking about trying to duplicate in Myanmar, they've got it operational enough now that the local users, they've got like 1,000 local users, each one of them pays $1.50 a month for unlimited local calling. So you can see how that's going to provide the numbers that's enough to provide the satellite backhaul. The satellite internet that my parents have on their farm in Iowa costs about $65 a month. So satellite is not necessarily very expensive anymore. And then somebody's going to have to pay for the interconnection with the public switched phone network, a SIP provider. But we all know how to do that already because we all have Skype. So we're talking, you know, between 1 and 3 cents a minute. So then it becomes a system of setting up some sort of billing. If you've got a community with 1,000 or 1,500 users, that's not at all impossible.
Yes, Mallory?
Are you talking about Rhizomatica?
Yes.
Yeah, so Rhizomatica is a really interesting example for a couple reasons. One is they actually were able to get licensed by the government. It was a bit of a loophole, but so they're legitimate. And actually they're working so closely now. These are like guys that go to Oaxaca every winter, like barefoot activist guys that now they're consulted by the Mexican government and they go and rep them at the ITU. So they've actually really legitimized what they're doing. And also it's interesting because I think they don't provide internet. It's just it's cell phone only.
So the basic system right now is 2.5G, so it's GPRS, so it's got like really slow internet.
Yeah.
But the newest iterations that are available from the company that produces the equipment that they use now provides 3G.
Yeah, I mean, got with them a couple months ago, and one of the things that Rhizomatica is trying to do is actually kind of do an ISP in the box sort of thing. I think that's the next step for them, complete with like things like billing and so on, because theirs is very much a community project. Like they started with the people, and that's I think probably how they got their user base, and the fact that it's like a sort of techie project is more of a side issue for them. It's really interesting how they've sort of organized the whole thing. But yeah, it's a great model, and I think that the difference, we sort of talk about licensed versus unlicensed. I think they're sort of it's a rarity for sure that they have license, but it also shows that this is not an issue of licensing. It's just an implementation issue, and the licensing should be really a secondary conversation.
So the backhaul in this case is satellite.
It depends on the system. I mean, you could use the point-to-point microwave that you've been using for your projects in India. It depends on whatever's closest in terms of some point of presence that you need to connect to. I mean, if you're on an island nation down in the South Pacific, then you're going to have to use satellite.
Yeah.
But if you can set up some microwave connection, then of course that would be superior in the sense of both lower lag time and lower cost.
Thanks, this is interesting. And you said that there are examples in Mexico and Indonesia. Yeah. So
and Zambia, and Niue. I'm not sure I even know how to pronounce that right, Niue, an island nation in the South Pacific somewhere, which I've not been to.
So I'll get to you on that, to those examples, so that we can do a little study on them. Thank you very much. May I now move to Chris?
Sure, thank you. I will build on the technical commentary that Eric started with and maybe take it up one layer of abstraction. Building from the last job I had before I worked at Mozilla, I worked at the Department of State in the United States. I'm on the Internet Freedom Team, and one of the public projects, one of the ones that I can talk about, was funding the Commotion Mesh Wireless Network, which I know includes OpenBTS as part of the sort of planned technology stack, though I don't know how far along that got, so I have some sort of firsthand experience with the technical side of this. When we talk about unlicensed spectrum, a lot of the time people are talking about ad hoc mesh networks, so unlicensed spectrum to connect people to each other in response to disaster scenarios or other environments where existing infrastructure doesn't work or was never built in the first place. And I just want to drive home something that we're not really talking about a lot, which is that the ultimate goal does need to be connecting people to the global open internet. I know this is on everybody's mind. I just want to make sure that technically we understand there's a difference between wireless connections and wireless connections that have that backhaul connection to the rest of the global internet infrastructure. We've talked about the different technologies that can happen. I really liked hearing Mallory giving a reference to building fiber backhauls alongside public works. It's something that can help this ecosystem throughout the world, not just for unserved communities, but for underserved communities where there aren't enough options, where the prices are too high, where we don't have a healthy telecom infrastructure in place. Building fiber as far as it can get, in as many places as we can, makes it much, much easier to put up a wireless access point and then get the benefits out of more unlicensed spectrum, more licensed spectrum, reusing spectrum more frequently to get more efficiency out of it. It's a really important thing to do. Of course, we're also talking about a lot of environments where there are mountains and jungles and hostile terrain to imagine putting fiber in, and where microwave signals can't go through the mountains, and so satellite is always an option. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but I just wanted to sort of tease that out a little bit more and make it specific. The other sort of technical piece that I want to talk about is devices. This is tricky, right? If you get spectrum but you don't have a device that can use that spectrum, then it's useless to you. So Mozilla is making inexpensive smartphones for many countries around the world, and these are mostly licensed spectrum-based devices, right? They have Wi-Fi, they have Bluetooth, they have that sort of core of unlicensed connectivity that we've come to expect from a mobile device, but we work with telcos. We do that because that's the right way to get a maximum connection right now. So I would pivot on that and say, one thing we need is more investment from everywhere in the world, including maybe in particular the Freedom Online Coalition countries, on things like software-defined radio and technology standards that can produce devices that aren't custom built for specific environments, but devices that can be built and used anywhere to take advantage of more unlicensed spectrum. I tossed the phrase software-defined radio in there, and I want to make sure that everybody knows what that means, right? This is the potential for devices that aren't set to use specific bands, but that are capable of opportunistically using any spectrum around them that's not currently in use, and doing it in a polite way, a way that can react to licensed users and sort of get out of the way. And you know, we talk about specific bands, but if you can use anything, the radio spectrum is enormous, absolutely enormous. So the future potential for devices that can opportunistically go from one band to another are just amazing, particularly in rural environments where there are many, many fewer licensed users and many fewer uses of the spectrum. So just from the technology point of view, I think there's a tremendous amount of potential here, and maybe some unusual ways of exploring how to make the most of that.
Thank you, Riley. A very interesting way to solve access problem is to go into the softer side rather than the harder side. And also in terms of spectrum, the harder side, but in terms of the devices, in terms of the radios, going towards the softer side. So that's interesting. We have last intervention left for Jushai.
Thank you. We've actually had a pleasantly refreshing discussion of some of the technical aspects for a session like this. So I might actually speak a little bit more about some of the policy side and take it another further level of abstraction up. I think that we've heard a lot about the importance of unlicensed spectrum. I think for this community, that makes a lot of sense. Why does it not happen, right? I mean, what are the mechanisms by which, it makes so much sense, it seems to provide so much value, but, the telecoms have a pretty strong incentive here, and governments have a pretty strong incentive here to try and license that spectrum, right? Some of the most powerful frequencies, that could be used for connecting people are reserved for licensed uses, and that's not just telcos, that's actually not fair. TV, radio, a lot of other very large incumbent industries want to have license and exclusive license to spectrum. And I think that part of that is because for government actors, licensing spectrum in that way presents a really significant and very immediate short-term economic windfall. We're talking billions of dollars, or whatever your local currency may be, in a lot of different markets and even in less developed markets. I think, though, if we take a step back and look at the economic benefits of some of our most famous unlicensed spectrum frequencies, if we look at 2.4 or 5 gigahertz, if we look at Wi-Fi, if we look at Bluetooth, I mean, that's at least billions, if not trillions, in economic value and economic benefit. Does it hit the government, bank account the next day? No, but in terms of the long-term economic benefits, unlicensed use is actually there, and there's a very strong economic case to be made there, as well as a very strong connectivity case to be made. So I think that particularly when we sort of are able to envision the medium to long-term economic benefits of unlicensed spectrum, combined with where we are going technologically in terms of increased spectral efficiency, as well as some of the more software-defined radio, some of the new technologies to use spectrum smarter and more efficiently and more effectively, there's really no excuse for not making more effective and dynamic uses of spectrum to connect people. And this is indeed one of the most powerful tools and some of the most easy tools that government has to promote connectivity from a sort of top-down sort of government level. Thank you.
Thanks. In fact, I wanted to respond to your point on economic case and the connectivity case for the telcos. If these are the good examples, then why it is not happening, And what is our learning is that the reason why it is not happening by the telcos is because the areas where we want them to connect is very dispersed. It doesn't give them volume for the kind of infrastructure that they have to build and the investment that they have to do. It's not a quick buck return within a stipulated time of period. That's number one. Number two is working in remote areas culturally is very different than urban areas. It requires much harder, longer gestation period to connect because they are culturally very strong. They live like a community. They do not live like apartments where nobody knows each other, but they still, economically upmarket. They don't do anything without knowing each other, without connecting with each other and things like that. And it's a huge population. It's not a small population that we are talking about. 70% of the country lives in rural areas, and it's the same in all the developing countries. So economic case is the biggest issue for the telcos. But more than that, like most of our experiment also says, is regulation itself is a big barrier. For everything that we had to do, for example, if we cross the height of the tower for more than 5 meters, we have to go to the clearance because it's not allowed. And then for what purpose? If you're doing it commercially, then it's longer and it takes longer, or it takes for us to pay bribe and so on and so forth. If it is not for commercial use, then it is free, but then again, you need to inform them and so on and so forth. You have to go to local municipality and then the regulator itself and so on and so forth. So regulation itself is a barrier for access and connectivity, number 2. Number 3 is the security, because of, like Frederica told in the beginning, that when you get connected, security and privacy becomes one of the big issue. But security is one of the biggest issue for ISPs. They have to log each and every person, that who is connecting, from where are you connecting, what are you looking at. It's part of their, responsibility to keep a log. And since they have to keep a log, they have to make sure that their franchises are keeping a log, whether they are selling this connectivity on their name, on their own name, and so on and so forth. So even for a not-for-profit, we cannot sell connectivity per se, because I'm not a franchisee, I'm not an ISP, even if I want to connect them. And if I become franchisee, then I have to take a log of each of the person. So regulation, policy, privacy, security are indirect hindrances to the access, even if technologically possible, spectrum-wise possible, infrastructurally possible, and so on and so forth. Yeah, you were, I think, wanted to say something.
Just completely agree. I mean, I think when it's very easy to say, well, this band should be licensed and this band should be unlicensed, or we need to have more unlicensed uses. But I think that you point to, it's not just about that technical distinction of licensed versus unlicensed. There's a whole sort of regulatory infrastructure that builds on licensing infrastructure and licensing regimes. And so I think you're absolutely right to identify that and to identify those as barriers. And I think that in terms of government paradigms here for connectivity, for empowerment, looking at that sort of reducing those regulatory hurdles is part of really realizing the power and potential of unlicensed spectrum. I think in that regard, what I was trying to say, though, is that if you wanted to look at something that a government today could do to try and dramatically change the environment, that could, empower many people to connect. And there are still real world challenges in terms of,
Yeah.
reaching rural communities in particular. But in terms of something that government can do and that has a very powerful, tool in their arsenal here, making more spectrum on license and reducing some of those regulatory hurdles is one of the most powerful things they have. And so that is also, I think, as much as we explore new technologies to work within existing sort of licensing frameworks, this is another, I think, piece, looking at this from a policy perspective, from a regulatory perspective, also has to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you. Anybody else, would you like to make an intervention? We open it up for more people to get into this discussion. If you can raise your hand, there is one in the corner, and then Poncelet. Yes, please introduce yourself. And
Yes, my name is Kenneth Edu Amanfo from Ghana, and I'm actually with the regulator, telecoms regulator. Just a comment on the, in terms of the investment issues that are preventing the telcos from deploying, in the rural area. Listening to, what has been said so far, I think I can say that it looks like Ghana is moving in the right direction. Even though we are not there yet, it looks like we are moving in the right direction. In terms of the white space, realize that Google has done a trial in Ghana as well in one of the densely populated areas, and that was also successful with no interference at all. In terms of the barrier to deploying technology in the rural areas, which is quite expensive, as the speakers have already said, what the regulator has done in terms of regulatory issues was that we issued a license, broadband wireless license in the 3.4 to 3.7 range. Now, we gave this to not the operators, but we gave it to other companies. We issued to 4 companies. And this also this license was supposed to enable them to deploy modern technologies, wireless technologies, which are less expensive and then easy to deploy to connect the rural areas. And then we added a clause to this. Now, the clause was that if you're able to cover about 70% of the rural areas, you can deploy mobile as well. So it's not a mobile license like a telecom mobile operator, but if you're able to first deploy broadband access to the rural areas to cover about 70% of the communities, rural communities, then you have the ability to do mobile as well. So in fact, this even pushed the existing mobile operators also wanted to do same. We said no, we want to give it to different people. It was also to encourage local, participation and all that. So I think these are something like Ghana is doing that I think if other countries will toe that line, it will help, deploy the connectivity. Yeah.
thank you,
Thank you.
Poncelet.
Thank you very much. It's Poncelet. I'm speaking from the YMCA, the Gambia. I have sort of 2 questions. I'm listening to all the presentations, and it's good to hear what my colleague from Ghana, who works in the regulatory authority, just mentioned. One is in regards to cost. Mallory mentioned about the various varieties that exists, and it will also be very good because most of these things, you have new technologies coming in all the time, and these technologies is always said it is geared towards rural communities or remote communities and stuff like that. And what are the cost implications? Because what is now the whole essence, especially when I look at access and universal access in general, is we are going into a situation whereby communities now take ownership. And if communities take ownership, cost becomes an implication to that. And because most of these communities, they have a certain income level. And I liked the way, I've forgotten the name now from Internews, when you mentioned about the ERIC, for the cost you. all your examples you gave, you put cost, and these costs were very minimal, which even in Little Gambia will be able to afford. So that's one thing I would like to get clarity. Another thing with the regulatory framework, like even my colleague from Ghana mentioned, you have all the examples you mentioned where, okay, you have there are companies. I'm looking at situations whereby you have social enterprises, like if my NGO, like YMCA, want to do stuff, we are involved in ICT4D, want to do a lot of deployment for our rural nurses and stuff like that who work in remote parts and have to deal with stuff with public health care and all these issues. We want to give them access. And you talk to the regulatory agencies, and all they keep on talking is money, 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 money. You have to have a license for this, you have to have a license for that. So I don't know, how do you go about it, especially because I think most of the time they say they get their guidance from ITU, and at the same time the ITU is also talking about universal access and all those things. And lastly, I will say, I've not seen in Gambia that we don't have, I say Gambia is unique because in Gambia we don't have a situation where we have any of the multi-telcos that operate in Africa. We don't have the MTN, we don't have the Orange, even the Orange is in Senegal, which is next door to us. We have like their local telcos, and they don't want to co-share in terms of infrastructure. Everybody who just wants to do their own thing for a population of 1.8 million people, which the market is really small. So how do you go about that within a regulatory framework, and you want to bring in someone that wants to do social enterprise that will also improve the socioeconomic development of the rural dwellers, and in turn make them to be more empowered to make money to pay all those things. So those bothers me. I don't know whether we have answers to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more interventions from, yes, please, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Juan Carlos. I'm the Costa Rican ambassador to the UN, and I'd like to learn more about the unlicensed spectrum. How is it managed in practice, and if there are any examples of countries that have opened it into a certain degree, to see exactly how it's distributed, contrary to like assigns parts of the spectrum, like for community or educational or other uses. I'd like to get to know more about the specificities of the management. Thank you.
Chris, you want to take it up?
Yeah, I'd like to go first if you don't mind, and then pass to Mallory and Eric. The beauty of it is that it's not assigned. And so when you think about how communications happen in networks, so I could talk for much longer about this, but I will try to avoid switching into professor mode and stick to a simple explanation. The only reason everyone can't use the same spectrum at the same time is interference. So the question is, how do you manage that? How do you keep that reduced? And the beauty of unlicensed is that it has mechanisms within the technology to manage that in such a fashion that you don't need to assign it. It's not magic. Wi-Fi is the best example. We all have Wi-Fi. There are probably 50 or more devices in this room that have Wi-Fi on right now, and it works. It's just kind of amazing how it does.
So I can share a link to an article, but Singapore has a regulatory framework for TV white spaces, and it's a quite impressive piece of policy because they did a huge consultation with industry to put it together. So it's actually quite good, and it's a good example. But I think, yeah, to Chris's point as well, like there isn't a need really to regulate it. I think it could be regulated even at the device level. So I mean, the devices, and I think you implied that, but you didn't say it explicitly, that I mean, the technology itself is so precise. I mean, back in, when the ITU was established, so we're talking more than 100 and however 50 years or something. I mean, devices using sort of radio were imprecise, and so there needed to be major gaps. But the whole point of the beauty of TV white spaces today and the digital migration and the whole thing is that our devices now are extremely precise, and the evidence shows of how, hundreds of people at this conference can be connected with all of their various devices and using it without interference. So I think the regulation comes from the device level, but it also, like in Singapore's case, can come at sort of the policy level. And without knowing the details actually of the regulatory framework, to be perfectly honest, I mean, it could also then influence the way devices are made. Yeah. So I'll tweet that out, and you can look into it.
Okay, so more just step by step. There is open spectrum numbers or whatever or the frequency is listed in ITU. Every country has their own list of open spectrum. It may not be necessary that 5.8 and 2.4 gigahertz is open in India. It would be open in Costa Rica also. So you have to check with your telecom regulation. After that, there is a whole list of all the devices that need to be in relation to that spectrum, how it works, what is that device that you need to buy, what should be the frequency of that device, can it go beyond, for example, 5.8 gigahertz if you are using, we cannot use modems or the relay devices much more powerful than a certain limit, because then you can connect 200 kilometers, which is not allowed. So the limit that is allowed may connect only 30 kilometers or 20 kilometers or even lesser, and that too when you have a line of sight. So all those specifications are there. I mean, I'm just telling you from step by step. If you want to go and figure out, that is the best way to go figure out. Otherwise, it'll give you email, and what we have done, we have a whole guidebook for that. Maybe you can just figure that out, that what will work in your country. That's the best way to go.
So
yes, Erika?
We'll go first.
Well, I wanted to take the conversation again a bit back from the tech, so I'm not sure if you wanted to
Regulatory.
conclude with something of the tech side.
No, I wanted to mention really quickly that one of the
Yeah.
challenges that has been mentioned by a number of people is the ITU, the Global Telecom Regulatory Board.
ITU itself is a challenge. Yeah.
Technically, the ITU isn't a regulator. It's just a UN institution which helps coordinate countries' regulations. So countries are the ones that do the regulation. But so one of the challenges that we face, because part of what we do at Internews is policy advocacy. We've done it in India. We were part of the coalition, I think, that helped actually adopt the decision, the ITU's proposal to not regulate the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum. But so one of the challenges that we in the community of all of us here face is we aren't really represented at the ITU. So the ITU has three kinds of members, right? It's got governments, it's got corporations, and then it's got the rest of us. And that rest of us, there's almost nobody there. And one of the problems is it costs something to get in, and another problem is it's a little bit bureaucratic. But I don't know of any NGO in the world right now which actually has a seat at the table at the ITU. So when the discussion comes up, okay, what about that TV white space? Shall we unregulate it or deregulate it? Or what about some higher frequency? The adoption of the ISM unregulated frequencies, the 2.4 and 5.8, a number of years ago, which is what essentially gave birth to the whole Wi-Fi everything. Are any of us there at the ITU trying to figure out what the next 2.4 should be? I mean, Mozilla is probably talking about it, and Google is probably talking about it, but what about all of us out in the developing world? A few years ago, I looked into that. We almost got a seat at the table. The ITU was sort of saying, yeah, we kind of might welcome you if you're really nice to us, and we might waive the $25,000 fee and so on. But again, this is an issue. Who among us is actually sitting at the ITU table? Nobody.
ISOC is not member of ITU? I think they...
APC is a member of ITU-D.
ITU-D, okay.
They have different tracks.
They have a bunch of different tracks, and
Yes.
it's not too hard to get a sort of I don't know, you could call it a sort of an associate membership type thing,
Yeah.
where they send you out some emails from time to time. But the question is whether you're actually at a point where you have access to all the technical details, the specs that are being discussed by the MNOs of tomorrow about how they're going to control all those frequencies. And the first problem is just getting a seat at the table, and then the second, of course, is understanding what's going on.
And so to note too, I mean, for people interested in trying to participate, the World Radio Conference, I don't know what the C is actually right now, but that only happens every 4 years or something. I think it's coming up this year in 2015. So it would actually be useful, I think, if there were civil society groups interested in going, sort of band together and come as a block, because it's a good opportunity, but it's also one that if you just sort of show up, it's unlikely that much can really move.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the challenges that Noel was talking about, and one of them was the no funding perspective. And then Chris was saying maybe FOC members can actually play a role there, so government. Osama, you were saying about the barrier that there's no positive business case for telecom companies to actually deploy in rural areas. But then I wanted to look at the intentions, like organizations like yourself, you're driven by this human rights perspective. Companies are revenue driven. I just wanted to put it out there, you know. How can we challenge companies more and actually work together with governments to make sure companies are actually, you know, facilitating it more than just putting it there at the government?
Can I add just a quick note to that? Actually, a lot of companies are very invested in promoting more unlicensed spectrum because they can make a lot of money off of it. Like the telcos are starting to get in on this too. The internet industry, out of my close colleagues and others, have been in on this for quite a long time. So there really is a lot of money to be made, and yes, as you say, a lot of collaboration potential here.
That's what you say. There's money to be made in it, and exactly that is, you know, the perspective of nonprofits is so different. Why, you know, half of the world is revenue driven, and the other part of the world isn't. So how can we, you know, merge more?
Hello. Good morning. My name is Angelica from Costa Rica. My intervention is more related with the topic about the contents and about the next step of the access. In the case, the access is an important issue for people in general. But in countries as Costa Rica, we done an important investment in those topics. Today, our mobile penetration is over 150%. That means we have 4.5 million people, and we have around 7.5 million mobile lines. That means an important opportunity for us, and to bring access and to bring other opportunities to the people in general. The access is not a full solved issue in Costa Rica, but we think that we look forward for the next step about the innovative uses of the technology. Not just like the final goal is more focused on how we can empower people to use the technologies, and how the technologies can help people to gather better options in their lives. We have a project very similar than the project that they already present. We call it CESI, as the acronym in Spanish is called Centros Comunitarios Inteligentes. It's around 250 centers in all the country that provides free access to internet and basic courses as use of internet or uses of the platforms like Microsoft or very basics. Focus on people that needs or requires digital literacy. The project was very successful. We have many experiences about. We were working with adult people, with children, with young mothers, and others. But our concern right now, or our main challenge, is how to provide knowledge and how can create capacities in those people to use the technologies as a tool that can help them to get a better options in their lives. My question is, in the terms of what is your experience about the promote on empowerment beyond the access? More focus on the use, more focus on the collaborative work, and how the governments and the industries can work together to bring those opportunities to people who not has the abilities right now to work or to improve their lives in a digital world. Thank you.
Those are a very elaborate question, very quickly tell you that when we connect to the remote communities like you do through telecentros and all that, we also have those kind of thing about 150,000 or something. But the motivator in most of these places is government entitlements, government services, because that is the maximum that anybody needs. And the second is education. Third is entertainment. And the fourth is, commercial services. If you ask me to order them, it's the entertainment that comes first, but we always give them the last choice as a provider, because we have our own way. We think that the poor people and the remote people only need basic services, most essential services, education and all that, but they need entertainment. Like when we connect for the first time our rural communities, the first thing they open is YouTube and Facebook, and they watch movies. Which they do not get a chance otherwise. So we certainly undermine the, what they need in terms of, so these are the motivators. But government entitlements, because government promises them health and, education and house and all those kind of things, but they are not available because of the lack of information. So they need to access that one. So can we just rapidly, finish it by asking all of you to give us 3 points, what should be done to make access universal and much, to make it reach to the large number of people. Just 2-3 pointers. It could be anything, just bullet points, so that we have. You have spoken that in one way or the other, but just 3 bullet points that we should do. A, B, C. Each one of you. Mallory.
I think
it can be a word also.
Okay, if only. Yeah. I think the first thing is, civil society or people, even industry as well, showing up to counter the narrative that TV white spaces is not the right solution and it's not ready, and actually pushing regulators to understand that that's not true. Infrastructure sharing is another important way. The municipalities and regulators need to, not regulators, but people implementing it on behalf of governments and with industry. And I don't have a third one. Those are the 2 main points I wanted to make.
It's a big point. Eric?
Well, in general, minimizing regulation seems like a refrain we've heard a lot in this room today. Asking regulators to justify why they want to generally constrain access to frequencies, and pushing for more unlicensed frequencies or ISM bands, the expansion of ISM bands. In the US, one of the top issues that we're facing on a regulatory basis right now with respect to telecom is simply allowing communities the right to set up their own telecom infrastructure. So in some sense, we have it worse than a lot of other countries. Most other countries haven't even thought to tell a city, no, you can't set up your own telco. In the United States, many states have banned that at the behest of the big telcos, who of course want to have the monopoly rights. So in some sense, this might be something to put on the agenda for those of you who are engaged in policy advocacy in developing countries, to preemptively try right now to ensure that governments adopt policies that specifically allow the establishment of community telecommunications systems or operations or services or whatever we want to call it. Because the alternative is, once your telco, your MNOs get powerful enough, they will probably try to ban those community services. Okay, two's enough.
Veronica.
I have 2 as well. Call me an idealist, but I think we need a mind shift with companies towards social entrepreneurship, and we need government reshift of priorities. We should not need NGOs, actually. Governments should take care of those things.
Chris?
I'll stick with 2 as well, though one of them's a slight 2-parter. I'd say that innovation in technologies, business models, and approaches, because I don't feel like we've solved all the problems in this space as yet. And then more investment in and development of and innovation in devices that can take advantage of all of these. Back to my earlier point about building software-defined phones that could work anywhere in the world, and then sending them everywhere.
Noel?
Well, I suppose I have two as well. One is more holistic thinking, especially for governments when it comes to solutions, because there is no lack of innovation coming from the ground. We've seen that in the Wireless for Communities project, but how institutions accommodate them, how institutions accommodate new approaches, novel setups, is another thing. So I suppose, you know, in things like spectrum allocation, we need a more holistic thinking into not just a particular interest or an established interest, but also other interests, like, well, I suppose public interest is one of them. And the other thing is, when it comes to regulation, more regulatory teeth for the giants, and I suppose more regular kind of a freedom to innovate for the smaller players.
Anybody else want to give any pointers? Well, thank you very much. It was very engaging. I personally learned a lot. And the speakers who confirmed and be there, spent their time, thank you very much. I'm going to engage with you individually and learn more. And maybe we'll be able to invite many of you to come to India and see those innovations that we have been able to do. Thank you very much once again.